In May 1974, music critic Jon Landau said about a little-known but up-and-coming singer-songwriter, "I've seen rock and roll's future, and his name is Bruce Springsteen." In 1919, after a trip to the newly established Soviet Union, US journalist Lincoln Steffens wrote, "I've seen the future, and it works." Today we begin to look at the three short letters attributed by church tradition to John that we find almost hidden away toward the end of the New Testament. We'll ask who the writer was, what his purpose was in writing, and what his main message was, and then we'll begin looking at the detail. So, who was the writer John? Probably the aging apostle, one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, the same person who had the vision whilst in exile on the island of Patmos that we know as Revelation. He probably had oversight of several churches in Western Turkey, which was then known as Asia Minor. He was probably in effect an area overseer or bishop. If you read the first letter, 1 John, the parallels to the Gospel of John are clear from the very first sentence. And this is perhaps the main reason why this letter has always been considered as being written by the same person who wrote the fourth Gospel, the Gospel of John. The theme of love is common to both John's Gospel and these letters. God so loved the world, John 3:16. God is love, 1 John 4 verse 16. The encouragement to love is common to both the Gospel of John and these letters. The Word became flesh, John writes in the prologue to his Gospel. The Word of life, John describes Jesus as being in the first verse of 1 John. In fact, as we'll see as we go through this letter, the key themes are love, light, and fellowship or oneness, all key themes in the fourth Gospel. What was John's purpose in writing these letters? If it was the John who wrote Revelation, he was, we believe, as I said, the pastor of a number of churches in Asia Minor. Some of the 7 churches addressed in Revelation that we looked at last year, earlier this year in fact. Writing as pastor, John's purpose would have been to teach, to remind, to encourage, to reassure and to strengthen those in his care, his flock, the church, churches and individuals. Because the 3 letters that we have preserved, and he may have written many more which haven't survived, are not written to the same audience. The first letter isn't formally addressed and there's no surviving introduction, but it appears to be intended for a number of churches, and it's almost a tract setting out the basics of faith in Jesus and how others can come to be part of the fellowship of believers. More of that in a moment. The second letter is introduced as being from the elder, which backs up the theory that this is John, the aging apostle, who would have been, by the time these letters were written, old or aging and a church elder. The last of the 3 letters is again introduced as being from the elder, but is addressed not to churches or a church, but to an individual, Gaius. So, John's purpose in writing these letters was to teach, to remind, to encourage, to strengthen, and help others teach and pass on the faith. Towards the end of the first letter, John states his purpose in writing by saying, I'm writing these things to you so that you may know that you who believe in the Son of God do indeed have the life of the age to come. What is the life of the age to come? Well, we'll come to that too in a moment when we look at the start of the first letter. What was John's main message? In the first letter, which we know as 1 John, the main message is, we've already said it, light, love and fellowship, and crucially that the life of the age to come is now. So, first letter and first chapter. That which was from the beginning, John says in verse 1 of 1 John 1. That which was from the beginning. An odd way, you might think, to start a letter. But maybe not so odd when we remember John's first words in his account of Jesus' life and death, his gospel. Those first words which were, in the beginning was the Word. And who was the Word? The Word is Jesus. Who is John talking about here in this letter when he said that which was in the beginning? Jesus. Which we have heard, seen with our eyes, gazed upon and touched, John says. Yes, John is talking about Jesus, who he then describes as the Word of life. This is who is being talked about and proclaimed in this letter. Jesus, the one whom John had known personally, intimately, had heard, seen, gazed upon, touched. That life, Jesus, is the life of the age to come, John says in verse 2. There are two ages in Jewish thought, the present age and the age to come. The present age, the here and now, characterized by trials, suffering, oppression and injustice. And the age to come, what life will be like when God sorts everything out. The age to come doesn't so much mean heaven or the next world, a purely spiritual existence. It's the new heaven and the new earth that John is shown towards the end of the vision in Revelation, when God creates and renews all things. So when John says his purpose is to reassure his flock that they have the life of the age to come, he's saying that new life, or simply life, that Jesus brings, announces, is theirs now. Another of John's themes in his account of Jesus' life, his gospel, was Jesus as the new temple, or the replacement for the Jerusalem temple. The temple was viewed as the place where heaven and earth meet, where God's sphere, heaven, and our sphere, earth, meet. And Jesus was becoming that, the place, or more the person, in which heaven and earth come together. Jesus was bringing God's future into our present, and he still is doing that. As followers of Jesus, as believers, we don't have to wait to experience the life of the age to come. We begin to experience it here and now when we believe and we are in fellowship with God and Jesus, Father and Son, and one with another. God's future, or God's new world, the age to come, has in Jesus broken into the present age. John is saying at the start of this letter, I've seen the future and his name is Jesus. Lincoln Stephen said something similar about communism and was proved wrong. Communism, at least in the way it was practiced in the Soviet Union, didn't work. It wasn't the future. John Landau said something similar about Bruce Springsteen and was partly right. Bruce Springsteen was, for some at least, the future of rock and roll. John said this about Jesus, that he was the future. God's future, not rock and roll's future. And in saying that, John was dead right. He was spot on. And that future wasn't something distant. It was here and now, and could be begun to be experienced here and now. In his gospel, John quotes Jesus as saying, "I've come that you might have life in all its fullness." This life is what John is writing about in this letter, and is announcing so that his readers might have fellowship with us, whose fellowship is with the Father and with his Son Jesus the Messiah, he says in verse 3 of the first chapter of this first letter. So that those who hear about Jesus might be one with those who've already heard about Jesus, and might be one with the Father and the Son, God and Jesus. Fellowship, togetherness with one another and with God. And this has strong echoes of John's Gospel, where Jesus prays that those who believe in him, may be one, so that everyone may believe. That's in John chapter 17, verse 21. And in verse 4 of the first chapter of this letter, John gives another reason for writing this letter. He says, "We are writing these things so that our joy might be complete." Following Jesus, being a child of God, not only by birth but by adoption, is, or it should be, a cause for great joy. But can that joy really be complete until all people have experienced it? Isn't there always going to be a sadness or an absence of complete joy when there are so many people who are missing out on what God has to offer, missing out on God's future here and now? So John writes in the hope that this news that God is light and love, and that we can be part of God's family, we can be in fellowship with God, experienced in the life of the age to come now, might be accepted and experienced by all, so that his joy might be complete. In the second half of this opening chapter, John describes God as being light and contrasts God as light with darkness, saying the two can't coexist. Of course, the theme of light is something that something else that this letter has in common with John's Gospel, where Jesus describes himself as being the light of the world. "I am the light of the world." John says here in this letter that if we say that we're in fellowship with him, we can't walk in darkness. If, however, we walk in light or in God, then we have fellowship, we have relationship with him. And Jesus' blood, his death on the cross, his death on our behalf, sorts out the problem of sin. And if we do this, if we walk in God's light, then we can't pretend we're sinless. But when we mess up, when we sin, then God sorts it. Walk in God's light, in fellowship with God. Don't pretend you're perfect. You can't fool God even if you succeed in fooling other people. And when you sin, when you mess up, which you will, we all do, then God will sort it. He will forgive you because of what Jesus has already done. What Jesus has already done, not just for you, for those who look like you and think like you and believe what you believe, but as John says here, John 1, chapter 2, verse 2, for the whole world. So, as our local poet Mick Neary would say, it's all about love, it's all about light, it's all about fellowship. And John's joy, our joy, and God's joy will be complete as we live in God's light and love and fellowship, and by doing so draw others to God, to God's love and God's light, and into fellowship, into oneness with him. God's future, the age to come, is not far off in the distance, but it's here and now. And we can be part of that future, and we can begin to experience that future, God's future, here and now, when we throw in our lot with Jesus, Messiah, Saviour, Rescuer, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and God with us. Amen.